Hello, everyone. My name is Craig Hancock, and I am the project manager for the Heber Valley Corridor EIS. Today, I'd like to present to you our findings from our alternatives development and screening process that we have been going through over the last several months. First, I'd like to discuss our project purpose. As you probably recall from earlier meetings and materials, the purpose of the Heber Valley Corridor EIS is to improve regional and local mobility, as well as provide opportunities for non-motorized transportation and allow Heber City to meet their vision for a historic town center. The project purpose is really important because it defines the overall goals for the project. It also lays a foundation for the types of alternatives that we have developed and have been suggested to us by the public. And it also provides a way that we can analyze each of these alternatives. UDOT published a draft purpose for the public and agency comments back in the spring of 2021. And based on that feedback, we did include the non-motorized transportation as a primary purpose. The project purpose is the one that you see before you right now. The last time we had an opportunity to share information with you, it was at the release of the conceptual alternatives in October of last year. Some of you submitted comments during that comment period. Thank you very much for that. We had a lot of public interest in the 17 alternatives that we initially developed. About 250 people attended the public meeting, and we received about 670 comments. There were 17 alternative concepts presented at the last October meeting, and at the two alternative public meetings. Those 17 alternatives, as you recall, there were 6 of those were alternatives on US 40 that made improvements to US 40 from 500 north to 1200 south. We had 3 east bypass alternatives that would provide a new road on the east side of Heber City. And then we had 7 west bypass alternatives that would provide a new road on the west side of Heber City. The team developed 3 concepts for the west bypass, and the 4th was submitted by a member of the public to the project team for evaluation. 3 of the western alternatives developed by UDOT had an option to realign the existing US 189. During the screening process, the western bypass alternatives with the option to realign US 189 were evaluated as individual alternatives. Then the final alternative was the transit alternative, which we're required to look at as part of our NEPA process. In addition to the 17 action alternatives, we also had a no action alternative. The no action alternative is required to provide a baseline for comparison. It evaluates the scenarios with population and employment growth through 2050, but nothing is done to address the needs such as congestion, slow travel speeds, long traffic queues, etc. It also assumes that all the roadway projects in the 2050 long-range plan are constructed except for this project. As I mentioned previously, we received many comments in our last comment period. Those comments are available on our project website now, and you can read each one of those comments individually. However, we have organized the comments into comment themes, which are shown on this slide. As you can see, there were many comments concerning the East Bypass. Some of the comments we received were that they had never been planned. There are also concerns with the East Bypass that it impacted neighborhoods. And there were concerns about safety with kids walking to schools. We also had some concerns about the west side and the fact that it was much less developed. There were fewer homes and schools. There are many comments, suggesting that there was that something needed to be done with congestion. And also that some expressed that congestion on Main Street would be better than impacting neighborhoods. We also received a number of comments concerning the North Fields and the fact that the North Fields are a treasure and that we shouldn't impact them. Similar to that, there are many comments concerning impacts to other natural resources such as wetlands, creeks, aquifers, wildlife, etc. And then finally, we had a number of comments concerning the development that would continue in the north segment of Heber City, and that a bypass should extend and tie in at SR 32. Based particularly on this last comment, we did take a little bit extra time to look at growth. To better understand what the growth on the north end, and what the potential implications were, we compared approved developments with the population growth in our travel demand model. As part of that, we met with Heber City, Wasatch County, and MAG to better understand how decisions were made regarding the population and employment projections and how those affected the travel demand model. What we found was that there was an additional 8,500 extra households that are planned for this area beyond what is currently in the travel demand model. In the center panel, you can see the areas that are planned for development. One of those areas is the North Village area. This area has about 2,000 households, and we expect that those households will likely come online prior to 2050. Based on that, we felt like this additional 2,000 homes would not be a significant variation in the model, and so we've chosen to continue to use the existing travel demand model. In addition to the comments that I previously talked about, we also received over 80 suggestions to modify alternatives presented to the public, and also some additions or some suggestions for additional new alternatives. Some of these suggestions included making improvements to US 40 north of downtown Heber City. Suggestions on US 40 included adding center barrier and frontage roads. Based on these comments, UDOT developed 6 new alternatives to take through our screening process. These new improvements included adding an additional one-way couplet on 100 East. And we also added 5 additional west bypass alternatives. 3 of these alternatives would extend further north through the North Fields area. 1 alternative would extend farther south through Daniels. And then 1 alternative added a 13 South connection to the WD alternative. UDOT also modified the bypass alternatives that tie into US 40 at 800 North by including improvements to US 40 north of downtown Heber City all the way to SR 32 for a complete alternative that extends from SR 32 to US 189. Not every suggestion resulted in new alternatives. Alternatives that would not meet the project objectives were not included. Alternatives that were outside the scope of the project also weren't included. Or if we had duplicative alternatives, we also didn't include those as well. I want to speak for a few minutes about our screening process and the criteria that we used. Our screening process is divided into 3 steps. The first step is the preliminary evaluation. In this preliminary evaluation, we determine if any of these alternatives have fatal flaws and should be eliminated, for reasons other than what is in level 1 or level 2 criteria. Once we go through preliminary screening, we move to level 1 screening, which evaluates how well the alternatives meet the purpose and needs for the project. The first criteria that we looked at in level 1 is local mobility, which focuses on downtown Heber and Heber Main Street. The criteria that we used in evaluating local mobility included levels of service, travel time on Main Street, and queue lengths. Another criteria that we used was Heber City Vision, which focused once again on downtown Heber. The criteria here included looking at impacts to historic buildings and valued places, including the urban parks on Main Street, and compatibility with Heber City's vision for Main Street, which includes lower speed limits, pedestrian and bike-friendly access, landscaping, and generally as a gathering place for the community. Regional mobility was also focused on through traffic. This would be our bypass traffic from SR 32 to 3000 South. The criteria here included travel times on the bypass and conflict points, which are the number of intersections and driveways. Alternatives that did not meet our level 1 criteria would be eliminated at this screening level. And then the remaining alternatives would then move into level 2, which evaluated the alternatives based on impacts to key resources and cost. The criteria here included impacts to wetlands and waters of the U.S., Section 4F, which are historic buildings and recreation resources. We also looked at right-of-way and property impacts and costs. Waters of the U.S. and Section 4F resources were used for screening because of the strong federal laws that protect them. UDOT is required to evaluate alternatives to avoid or minimize impacts to these resources. Laws prescribe which alternatives UDOT can select as the preferred alternatives. At the level 2 level, those alternatives that had higher impacts than others were eliminated. I'll also note here that we did not use non-motorized transportation as an element for screening alternatives, but we'll look at that in the next phase. Next, we'll talk about the screening results for level 1. This table here presents a portion of the screening results. There'll be the next slide will present the remainder. On this slide here, we show, if you look across the top, each of the criteria that we used in our screening process, starting with preliminary screening, and then local mobility, Heber City Vision, regional mobility, and then on the final column we have a recommendation for whether or not the particular alternative is to advance into level 2. Over on the left side of the table, we list each of the alternatives. You'll notice at the top, we start with the existing conditions for US 40. Then we have our US 40 no action alternative. And then we have each of the remaining alternatives along the left side. As an example of how this table can be read, if you start at the first column with preliminary screening and read down, you can see how each of the alternatives were evaluated for preliminary screening. You'll notice in this case that the transit alternative and the tunnel bridge alternative, which are showing in the color red, did not pass the preliminary screening. All the other alternatives did. And you can proceed as you move across to the right, how each of the alternatives were evaluated for each of the criteria and whether or not they passed that particular criteria or not. In general, as this table shows, all of our US 40 alternatives, the 6 alternatives that we studied, or the 7 alternatives, excuse me, did not pass the level 1 screening. In most cases, they didn't pass the local mobility or the Heber City Vision, with the exception of the one-way couplets, which did pass the local mobility criteria, but failed on meeting the Heber City Vision criteria. Also on this table, we show that the east bypass alternatives, the 3 east bypass alternatives, did not pass the screening as well. Primarily, they failed on the local mobility alternatives or criteria, primarily because the east bypass did not, alternatives did not pass or did not pull off enough traffic off of Main Street. This slide here presents the remaining screen results, level 1 screen results for each of the alternatives. It's organized similar to the previous slide we looked at. You'll notice that there's the alternatives on this screen are all the west bypass alternatives. There were several alternatives that did pass level 1, and there's a few that did not. We'll look in more detail on the ones that did pass level 1 screening in a moment, but I will point out the few that did not. The first alternative that did not pass the level 2 or level 1 screening, the west alternative, is our WA1 or WA2 alternative. This was our high-speed alternative on the west side that had 189 realigned on it. It failed primarily because of the number of the number of intersections had a level of service of F. And then moving down more towards the bottom of the table, we had several arterial alternatives, west bypass arterial alternatives. None of the arterials passed the level 1 screening, primarily failing on the local mobility as well. And then the WD alternatives that we had on the west also failed because of local mobility. And then the remaining alternatives that were left on the west bypass alternatives passed to level 2 screening. With level 2 screening, this is different than the level 1, as I explained earlier. Here, the key difference here is that we're looking at impacts to wetlands and other waters of the U.S. The impacts here ranged from 5.6 acres to 22.14 acres. We are also using very preliminary data for historic buildings. Historic building data requires field review and evaluation to confirm historic status. These preliminary findings may change in the draft EIS from what you're seeing here. Impacts range from 1 building to 8 buildings that could be demolished. All the historic residents and businesses are counted in the right-of-way column as well. The Section 4F recreation resources impacts are to trails can easily be mitigated with realigning the trails. Cost estimates are a very high level and include right-of-way and construction. These estimates could change when the alternatives are refined to a greater degree. It is also important to note that the estimates are in today's dollars. Based on our level 2 screening, WA3, which was one of our freeway options, was eliminated in level 2 screening because it would perform similarly to other alternatives, but would have a greater impacts to waters of the U.S. as you can see in the table here. Next, I would like to talk about the 5 alternatives that passed both level 1 and level 2 screening in greater detail. This slide here shows the 5 alternatives that passed through the screening process and that we will be evaluating in detail in the EIS. All 5 of these alternatives are west bypass alternatives. The main difference between the remaining alternatives are, first, the type of facility. One is a freeway facility. That's the WA1 alternative that you're seeing here on the far left. And then the other 4 alternatives are highway facilities with signalized intersections. Also, another differentiator is in the northern portion, which includes improvements on existing US 40 or is a new road, which extends all the way to SR 32. And then the other main differentiator is the connections on the south and whether or not US 189 is realigned on the south end. I do want to point out that we understand that the North Fields are an important resource to many in the community, and we appreciate the detailed comments many of you have provided about this resource. The NEPA process requires that we do evaluate a reasonable range of alternatives and provide an opportunity for public input on the range of alternatives. We did receive a number of comments during the alternative comment period back in October that we should extend the bypass further to the north to account for the planned development and growth on North US 40. There were people who were concerned that the bypass that ties into US 40 at 800 North is not a long-term solution. And so we were required to consider these comments. In a minute, I'll talk about each of these alternatives in detail, but I would like to talk about our cross sections that we're proposing to be used. We have several cross sections depending on where you're at on the alignment. This first cross section or typical section is our bypass typical section. This section shows a footprint and is largely the same for all 5 alternatives for the bypass section, with the main difference being the clear zone width with the WA1 alternative and then the WB alternatives. The bypass section would be 122 feet wide, and with the difference in the clear zone and WA1 of 34 feet compared to 24 feet for the WB alternatives. You'll also notice that we have a 50-foot proposed separation between the 2 lanes going in each direction. And this is a UDOT standard and is determined because of the higher speed on higher speed roads on the bypass sections. This typical section here is our 13 South typical. This is similar to a typical urban section. Here you'll notice that we have 4 12-foot standard travel lanes, but our median is much narrower. It's now separating the lanes with a 14-foot median. The shoulders are a little narrower, and we include a curb and gutter, which is consistent with the portion of 13 South that is currently out there today. This cross section is our US 40 North section. This is the portion of US 40 north of Heber downtown. You'll notice here that we have the 4 lanes in a total of 4 lanes with standard 12-foot travel lanes. Once again, we're using a 14-foot median, but we are recommending to include a raised median. Once again, the speeds are much slower here, so we can go with a much narrower median. Also included in this typical section is a frontage road shown on each side. And I'll explain a little more how we're using these frontage roads later on in the presentation. Similar to the previous slide, this is also a typical section that we'll be using on the US 40 North segment. The main difference here is that we just show a frontage road on the one side of this typical section, and this typical it will be primarily used for our highway alignments, or WB alternatives. What I'd like to do now is go into detail on each of the 5 alternatives. The first alternative we'll talk about is our alternative WA1, which is a freeway alternative. This alternative can be categorized as one that favors mobility over access, as compared to the other alternatives which we'll be looking at. With this alternative, we generally follow the corridor preservation alignment that has been previously acquired. It ties in to US 40 at 800 North, and then continues on from 800 North up to SR 32, and where we do make several improvements. This is a grade separated alternative. We have grade separations at 13 South, which includes, in this case, an interchange. We also have an interchange grade separation at SR 113. Looking at the south end, vehicles can also access the bypass between US 40 and US 189 at the interchange, shown with 113. Vehicles on the bypass would not have to stop at SR 113 or at 1300 South. This bypass would also be what we call an access category 1, which means that there would be no other access allowed in the future except at the interchanges. Also note with this option that there is a future interchange planned at US 40 and at SR 32 as a separate project. This will happen regardless of the outcome of the EIS. All action alternatives assume that the intersection will be placed by 2050. I'll also point out that there are 3 future traffic signals on North US 40 between SR 32 and 500 North. These intersections will be signalized when warranted by traffic, regardless of the outcome of this EIS. All action alternatives assume that these 3 traffic signals will be placed by 2050. The locations of these signals are at North College Way, Wasatch Commons, and Coyote Lane. With alternative WA1, North 40 would be an access category 3, which allows access only at signalized intersections. A frontage road system would be added to both sides of US 40 between SR 32 and 800 North, where the bypass connects. Vehicles could only get on and off of US 40 at the 3 signalized intersections. All other side streets and driveways would connect to the frontage road. The speed limit on the North 40 segment would be 45 miles per hour. Looking at the second table, which compares alternative WA1 to existing conditions and the 2050 no action alternatives, you'll notice that all the intersections under local mobility would operate at acceptable levels of service, similar to the conditions today, but better than the no action, which would have 3 failing intersections. I will note that there is 1 segment on Main Street that would operate at a level of service F. You'll also notice that the southbound queuing, which we measure at 500 North, would extend about 1,600 feet, which is about 1/3 of a mile, back from the intersection during the peak hour. This is the 95th percentile queue length, which means that the traffic model predicts what the queues will be. The queue will only get this long 5% of the time. So at least 95% of the time, this queue will be shorter. The predicted queue length is longer than it is today, but much shorter than it would be if we didn't do anything. If we don't do anything, the queues would be 13,100 feet in 2050, about 2.5 miles. At 2.5 miles, the queues would back up to about North College Way. The travel times on Main Street from SR 32 to US 189, which is the hub intersection, would be just over 10 minutes compared to the 8 minutes and 20 seconds that is there today. If we did nothing, the travel time would be 16 minutes and 40 seconds. It is important to note that the congestion would continue to get worse as growth occurs. All the alternatives we are evaluating in detail would have longer travel times on Main Street in 2050 compared to today. However, they would all be improvements as compared to doing nothing. Looking at the regional travel time, which describes the conditions on the bypass. The travel time for the bypass is measured from SR 32 to US 189, which is at about Edwards Lane. Edwards Lane was selected as an endpoint so that all the alternatives could be compared equally. The travel time on the bypass from SR 32 to US 189 would be just over 9 minutes and 10 seconds. Without a bypass, vehicles would continue to use Main Street. The travel time today is 10 minutes and 40 seconds. In 2050, it is predicted that to be just over 19 minutes. Travel times on the bypass with alternative WA1 would be a savings of about 10 minutes as compared to doing nothing. Looking at the impacts on this table, preliminary impacts with WA1, there's approximately 8.84 acres of impacts to waters of the US. So that's our wetlands, streams, ditches, and canals, which would be filled in. We also have 8 potential historic buildings that could be demolished. And there would also be, with this alternative, there would be, we estimate 18 residents and businesses which would need to be relocated. This alternative would cost approximately $234 million in today's dollars. Note that these impacts and costs are at a very high level and would likely change as we evaluate the alternatives in more detail. Next, I'll talk about the WB alternatives. These are the highway alternatives as we've discussed. Once again, generally this alternative, the WB1 alternative, and all the other WB alternatives generally follow the corridor preservation alignment, similar to the WA1 alternative that we just looked at. This alternative is a highway type function. It operates at a lower speed at the 55 miles per hour on the bypass portion, but it does provide more access as compared to the WA1 alternative. Another main difference between the highway alternatives and the previous alternative is that all the intersections are at grade, and that there are no interchanges. Like the WA1 alternative, the bypass segment extends from US 40 at 800 North, bypasses Heber City on the west side, and then connects to US 189 at Southfield Road. It would be at grade with signalized intersections at 800 North, SR 113, 1300 South, and US 189. The bypass would be an access category 3, which means access would only be allowed at signalized intersections. Unsignalized intersections and driveways would not be permitted. The speed limit on the bypass would be 55 miles per hour. Looking at 1300 South, the connection from US 40 on 1300 South would include intersections at Industrial Parkway, 300 West, US 189, similar as it is today. There would not be an intersection with South Daniels Road. Looking at North 40, we have the same assumptions as the previous WA1 alternative for an interchange at SR 32 and 3 signalized intersections between SR 32 and 800 North. Again, these would happen regardless of the outcomes of this EIS. With this alternative WB1, North 40 would be an access category 5, which allows access at signalized intersections, unsignalized intersections, and driveways. And there are minimum spacing requirements for each of these access points. Because of that, we are still implementing a frontage road system, but it would be more of a discontinuous frontage road, which would be constructed primarily on the east side, but there would be some portions on the west side as well. In stretches of North 40 where there are currently no accesses, no frontage roads would be constructed. If the area gets developed, developers would be required to construct the frontage roads as necessary to meet the minimum spacing requirements. And the speed limit on the North 40 segment would be 45 miles per hour. Looking at the table and looking at the criteria, you'll notice that for local mobility, all the intersections would operate at an acceptable level of service. One segment of Main Street would operate at a level of service F. For southbound queues, they extend about 1,500 feet, similar but slightly shorter as compared to the WA1 alternative. The travel times on Main Street from SR 32 to US 189 would be 10 minutes, similar to the WA1 alternative. If we did nothing, the travel time would be 16 minutes and 40 seconds. Looking at the regional travel time, on the bypass from SR 32 to US 189 would be about 10 minutes and 25 seconds, just over a minute longer as compared to the WA1 alternative. Travel time on the bypass with alternative WB1 would be a savings of about 9 minutes as compared to the do nothing alternative. Looking at the preliminary impacts, they are fairly similar to the WA1 alternative, but it would cost less. There's approximately 6.6 acres of waters impacted, waters of the U.S. that are impacted. 8 potential historic buildings could be demolished, and then 17 residents and businesses would be relocated. This alternative would cost about $173 million in today's dollars. Next alternative we'll talk about is the WB alternative. This is very similar to the one that we just looked at, with the main difference being that this alternative has US 189 realigned onto the bypass. The realignment of US 189 is from about Edwards Lane to 1300 South. And with this alternative, the existing US 189 would be removed. Under this alternative, there would be more traffic on 13 South because it would become the US 189. It would have similar connections to the WB1 alternative that we just looked at, with intersections at Industrial Parkway, 1300 West, US 189, and South 40. Like WB1, there would not be a connection to South Daniels Road. North 40 would be the same as with the previous WB1 alternative, with the partial frontage road system. Looking at the performance table, you'll notice that the local mobility is improved over the previous alternatives. All segments are performed better, with none of them having a level of service F. And also, queuing at 500 North is significantly improved. Preliminary impacts on this alternative are similar to the previous one, with very similar impacts to the waters of the U.S., historic buildings, and relocations of residents and businesses. And then the costs are very similar to what you saw on the WB1 alternative, coming in at $179 million in today's dollars. The next alternative we'll look at is the WB3 alternative. This alternative is similar to the WB1 alternative that we looked at, except that the bypass would extend all the way up to SR 32, and there would be no improvements made to North US 40. Once again, this alternative assumes an interchange at SR 32 would be a separate project. The bypass on this one is also the access on this bypass alternative also assumes to be a Category 3, which means that access would be allowed at signalized intersections only. No unsignalized intersections or driveways would be permitted. The 13th South is the same as the WB1, and as I mentioned, on the north, there would be no improvements made to North 40. However, the same 3 intersections would be signalized when warranted. Looking at the performance of this alternative, local and regional mobility are improved over the previous alternatives. We see better improvement to travel times, both the regional and local mobility. However, you'll notice that on the impacts that we do have increased impacts to waters of the U.S. However, we do see fewer impacts to relocations of businesses and residences. This alternative would cost about $191 million in today's dollars, which is more than the WB1 and WB2 alternatives that we just looked at, but less than the WA1 alternative. Finally, we'll look at the WB4 alternative. This is similar to the previous WB alternative that we just looked at. The main difference here is that is the realigning of US 189 on the south end. All the other features that we just looked at on the WB3 alternative are the same here. In terms of performance, the local and regional mobility are similar to the previous alternative. However, the queues are slightly longer than the previous alternative. Also, on the impacts, they're also very similar to what we saw on the previous alternative. We have the 12.4 acres of impacts to the waters of the U.S., 1 potentially historic building that could be demolished, 9 residents and businesses that would be relocated, and this alternative would cost approximately $197 million. This table here provides a summary of what we just went through for each of the alternatives, showing comparing the different criteria and how well they performed with each of the criteria, as well as looking at each of the impacts associated with each one. So you can use this table as a way of comparing each of the alternatives. Finally, we have this is also a summary slide that summarizes the characteristics of each of the alternatives. It summarizes makes comparison of each of the characteristics of the bypass, southern connections and northern connections. We'll also note here that we do make an adjustment to the way we name each of these alternatives based from our previous screening alternatives, and to a name change as we go forward into the Draft EIS. And you can see those names that we'll be using as we move forward into the Draft EIS. So this is what I have to prepare, or what I prepared to present as far as the results of our screen alternative. Next, I'd like to turn the time over to Naomi, who will be talking about our public involvement process.
Thanks, Craig. I'm going to speak a little bit about the current comment period and the importance of public involvement. So the current comment period will run through July 22nd of this year. To provide your comments, we ask that you use the formal channels provided: the project website, email, a mailed letter, a voicemail, or a text message to the project hotline. All those avenues are listed on this slide. Please focus your comments on the range of alternatives that we've presented, the criteria that was used to screen alternatives, the screening process, and the results of the initial impact analysis. This will help ensure that your comments are informed and captured in the official record. As a reminder, comments made on the social media platforms are a great way to share information, but are not considered formal input in the study process and will not be documented in the project record. If you are aware of anyone in the community without internet access or who needs certain accommodations, please notify the project team at 801-210-0498 for assistance with viewing materials or providing comments. Hard copies of project information are also available to view at the following locations: Heber City Administration Building, Wasatch County Administration Building, and the Wasatch County Public Library. A little more information about public comments, which are a really important part of this process. Your comments help us understand the various perspectives in your community and provide an opportunity for the public to share information or data with the project team that we may not be aware of. During this comment period, we are specifically looking for input on the draft alternatives development and screening report, the criteria we use to screen the alternatives as they relate to the project's purpose and need, and key environmental resources. We would also like to hear about any new data or information that could advise the screening process. An example of a good comment would be one that let us know about a new home being constructed that could be impacted by the project, but is not shown in our analysis. If a comment does present us with new data for consideration, we will assess whether this information could potentially affect the results of the screening process. It's important to remember that the NEPA process requires all alternatives that meet the purpose and need be evaluated, even if some may be unpopular. By following the NEPA process in its entirety, we have the best opportunity to fully understand the potential benefits and impacts associated with alternatives and to make an informed and defensible decision. In addition to making the report and various educational materials available on the study website, UDOT will present the results of the screening process at City and County Council meetings. Those times and dates are also posted in the project Facebook group. So a little information about what happens next. After the completion of the current comment period, UDOT will be working to design the remaining alternatives in greater detail and conducting detailed resource impact analyses. The detailed analysis will be documented in the Draft EIS, which will be made available for public review with an associated 45-day comment period. We will also hold a public hearing on the Draft EIS. We anticipate this will happen in late winter or early spring of next year. Thank you for listening to this presentation. We hope the information presented to you has been helpful.
Once again, we thank you for your time in looking at and listening to this presentation. We encourage you to study the materials that we provided on our website, and encourage you to provide comments. They are very helpful for us. Thank you for your time.